And we are here with the horror panel. Welcome, welcome, welcome. There's well, okay. There's the ongoing giveaway that's happening. All you have to do is type "We Thrive Together" in the chat with your Wattpad username, and you will get chance to win some Wattpad coins, a pack of 100. That will be chosen directly after the this panel. But I want to welcome you to the horror panel. We have Paul Kingston, Mason Fitzgibbon, or otherwise known as Mason Fitzy, Henry Scott, and T.L. Bodine. Okay, so we're going to go straight into the questions. The first question, I guess, that anybody ever asks is, why horror? Anybody want to pick it up? Okay, fine. I'm going to choose someone. Mason, go.
Okay, why horror? My journey with horror started when I was about 7 years old. The power went out one night, and my mom decided to tell me what a serial killer was, and I've been a little addicted to horror ever since. There's something about being scared, about the evil in people that I just find so interesting, and that's why I've pursued writing horror.
I feel like that story could have gone one of two very different ways.
If it was a horror movie.
My brother cried. I was more interested. I was like, tell me more.
Sounds like Dexter's origin story, you know?
Okay, Paul, what about you? Why horror?
For me, it was sort of two things that really sort of struck me about horror. First off, I've always just been fascinated by fear. You know, the older I've gotten, the more I've read up on like the history of humans in general as well. It's like you sort of start to realize that fear is sort of the guiding principle throughout history, right? It's like, you know, back in the days of, you know, Neanderthals and so on and so forth, it was like people used fear to survive. Like it was a survival tactic. You got scared of something, you ran away, you lived. If you didn't get scared, you were done, right? But then I also find it super, super interesting because it's not only a survival tactic, but it's also like, you know, in modern days with like social media and like all of our heads in the clouds and so on and so forth like this, it can also be just a super limiting emotion as well. So I just always find that fear is just such like an intricate and like very intriguing kind of emotion that just drives so much of our lives. And so tapping into fear is just so much fun because there's so many possibilities for it.
Okay, Tiana, you want to give us some insight?
Yeah, so for me, as with a lot of people, I guess, like I fell into horror really young. You know, I was just always into like the scary movies when I was a kid, and I had 3 older brothers, which probably influenced that. Like I was watching a lot of things I probably should not have been watching at a very young age, like Alien when I was like 4. I was like, yeah, this movie's so cool. But for me, a lot of the draw of horror is that there's room in horror for stories that you don't necessarily see in other places, because a lot of horror fiction is about people who are at a disadvantage. They're disenfranchised. They're struggling with, you know, whatever. Like a lot of people in horror are not cool, collected people. They're just folks like us who are stuck doing, you know, in tough situations. And so there's a lot of diversity that shows up in horror that you don't necessarily see in other genres, and I think that's really cool. And also, you know, I have anxiety myself, and I spend a lot of time in my day-to-day life like being terrified of things. So I can channel that a little bit into fiction and have a little bit of control over it, and I find that really empowering. And I mean, if I have to suffer this, so do you guys. I'm bringing you with me.
Henry, hit us with it.
I think it's just fun. I mean, it's exhilarating to read something or watch something scary. You feel alive. I guess to play off something Mason said, you know, as a kid, I watched Cujo at a friend's house And on my way home, walking home in the dark, a neighbor's dog barked at me, and I think I set a land speed record just running home. I thought that dog was going to get me. So, yeah, they're just fun. It's a good, safe place to confront your fears.
Okay, well, it's going to take us right into question number 2, which has nothing to do with dogs, by the way. As what, in your opinion, makes readers and audience gravitate towards horror? Tiana, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of people, it's that same thing. It's wanting to confront something that's frightening in a controlled environment. You know, it's wanting to, for a little while, be scared and it be okay to be scared. I think that's a big part of it. And I think part of it too is there's kind of a fascination with wanting to like reach out and touch the darkness, right? Like everybody knows there is terrible things that happen in the world, and you know, evil exists in whatever capacity. And sometimes you want to just try to understand it a little bit, or if not understand it, at least like watch it in a way that isn't going to hurt you, but will maybe make it make sense in your brain somehow. Because I think a lot of us spend a lot of time wondering, why do bad things happen? And horror sometimes can give answers to that.
Henry.
Yeah, I think like we've all been saying, it's just a kind of safe place to confront your fears. It gives you you can insert yourself into that situation and kind of play that what if scenario. What would I do if I was in that situation? Would I freeze? Would I run? Would I fight? It's just a safe place to, you know, confront everyday fears, and we certainly are all facing those.
Okay, Mason, what do you think makes readers gravitate towards horror?
I think just like everyone else is saying, it's a way to confront your fears. I think there's so many issues that go on in the world that they're just like things like the pandemic. It's not something that you can take on by yourself or something that even there's like an answer to. And it's something scary. Like I remember, like I'm a nurse, so when the pandemic first hit, we were all terrified, and I went on like a horror movie binge because it's like that's something that you can conquer and you can feel good about yourself because you managed to get through it and you managed to do it. So it kind of almost in a weird way sort of gave me like hope for the pandemic. I'm like, oh, we can all get through this, we can all do it. And so horror is supposed to be scary, but for me in a way it was almost like comforting.
Okay, I was not expecting that answer, but that's a great one.
There you go. It's cute.
Okay, Paul, I saw you nodding there.
Yeah, no, I was just agreeing. I mean, also it sounds like a burgeoning serial killer watching horror movies for comfort. But yes, sorry, no, but I think definitely people gravitate towards horror for a couple of reasons. I mean, first off, as the others have said, you know, the feeling of conquering a fear in a controlled environment is definitely something that a lot of people sort of naturally drift towards. I mean, it's the same reason that, you know, haunted mazes are huge around Halloween. It's because you get that spike of adrenaline and then that feeling of victory that follows, right? But I also wanted to bring back something that TL had mentioned earlier in regards to the inherent vulnerability of horror characters, right? Like they are typically broken people. They are typically much more relatable, right? Than your standard sort of like superhero characters, for instance, or whatever the case might be. Like there is a lot more vulnerability and a lot more pain in these characters that I feel just sort of pulls people in because they can identify with it, whether it's a direct line between their own vulnerabilities in the character or just sort of a bit of a tangential version of it. I think it's extremely relatable. And then, of course, add in the fact that horror is just like a really great way to flex your imagination because it can be limitless, right? It almost borders on the fantasy genre and the way that we can literally build any kind of world we want as long as we buy ourselves permission along the way. So, yeah.
Okay, nice. So people usually have a lot of like preconceived notions about horror. What are some of those that you've seen, and how would you want to go about setting the record straight? I'm gonna hit right back to Paul.
Yeah. Okay. Oh boy, some preconceived notions about horror. So I guess my first one, and this is not meant to be a shot at anybody, but my first one is that it doesn't always have to turn into some form of like romance with the supernatural being. I see that happening a lot as of recent, and I kind of blame Twilight for that. But that being said, I mean, there is room for like sort of like skipping back and forth and you know, crossing into other genres. I mean, one of the first horror movies that ever spoke to me, and I was shown it far too young of an age, was Nightmare on Elm Street. And Nightmare on Elm Street was a perfect example of the crossover between like horror and comedy / pop culture, right? Like I still to this day think of that that scene. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was Freddy's Dead, where it's like it cuts to Freddy sitting in a basement and he's playing on a Nintendo Power Glove, which at the time I was like, I want a Power Glove, right? And so it was like it was a direct reference to my life, right? And sure enough, you know, fast forward years and years and years later, and I had the pleasure of meeting Robert Englund, who turns out is a lovely human being as well, and I met him at the comedy club that I was working at the time. So it was just like, in all honesty, I mean, that's probably the biggest thing that I want to shatter about horror, is that it's like, A, it doesn't have to live in its own little bottle, but B, it doesn't always have to steer towards safe territory. Your job as a horror writer is to take people into vulnerable territories, into areas where they don't feel comfortable. That's part of the story, right? You want to put them in the condition of the character. You want to scare them. You want to make them feel like they're dancing on an edge. Anyway.
Okay, Mason, you want to pick it up?
Yeah, so one preconceived notion I have, I see a lot as like people's twist is the person was like their dual personality all along, or they were like schizophrenic, and that really like is so like that's just like, if you have that in your story, I'm gonna hate the story if it's not done right, because it tends to show people with mental illness as being violent and being the villains. So I think like that is a twist that's used. I think it has to be very carefully done. So that's like one notion where I'm always kind of like a little wary about. I feel like people should be careful about it. Another one is horror tends to be looked down as like the dirty genre. Like, you know, I know like a lot of times in the 80s and the slasher movies came out, they were really looked upon, and like the movie critics like Roger Ebert was just saying about how dirty these movies were, how awful they were, and that they're like horrible pieces of cinema. And I think in writing it's the same way, that it can be looked down upon because it's just, people see it as like gross horror and like just disgusting. But no, it's, horror can say a lot about our commentary on the society, and I think a lot of horror movies are very smart in what they say, and horror stories are very smart in what they say. So I think that it kind of deserves a little more credit than it gets.
Okay. Who wants to go? Come on, jump in. Okay, fine. I'm going to pick again. Yeah. Henry, go.
Yeah, I think, yeah, a lot of the preconceived notions fall onto, yeah, again, the kind of bad horror movies, just the jump scares, you know, like a cat jumping out at somebody, or the gore and Saw. I don't really, I mean, yeah, they're scary and they make you jump, but it's not what really gets you or is going to make you think about later. No, I think it's, you know, like something unexpected and a natural twist that happens in a normal circumstance. Another impressionable movie for me was watching Alien as a kid. I mean, it's kind of sci-fi, but I think it was a horror movie set in where everyone's just sitting around having their meal, and then all of a sudden, you know, the alien jumps out of that person's belly. I still think about that today. That was, so those are the kind of things that I think ring true for an audience.
It seems that I think we all have in common. We were all shown some horror movies in our early childhood. Tiana, are they? Finish us off with the preconceived notions.
Yeah, so I think a big thing that, like, if there's one takeaway that I want people to maybe think about horror, if they haven't given it, you know, a lot of thought before, is horror isn't just slashers, right? It's not just ghost stories. It's not just anything. Like, there is so much room and breadth and depth for all kinds of stories in the horror genre. And, you know, it's like Paul was saying earlier, like, there's so much ability to bring in, you know, whatever you can conceive of and whatever you can imagine and make a horror story out of it. And so, you know, there doesn't need to be a box, and there probably shouldn't be. Like, horror, if nothing else, is always kind of about like pushing the limit a little bit and being a little bit transgressive. And some of that is, you know, pushing the limits of genre and just trying new things. You know, horror, fantasy, Alien is horror in space. It's a haunted house story in space. You know, whatever you can mash together, do it and experiment with it and have fun with it. And I think that's really freeing, and I think that's really cool.
Okay, well, I guess we're going to go into the next one. We're going to stay with you, Tiana. Is there anything that still scares you?
Is there anything that still scares me?
Yes.
I mean, gosh, what doesn't?
Yes, well, I know you have the anxieties to go with.
You can't see this, but I am literally like sitting here like shaking, like under the table, like my legs just sitting here doing this. It's like, oh God, I'm on camera. It's terrible. But no, real life wise, I mean, it's a whole stack of things. Horror wise, like in the horror genre, I'm a lot more bulletproof because I've been watching this movie since I was like 3, and I've been reading Stephen King since I was 8. Who was monitoring this stuff? Jeez. But there's a couple tropes that just always get to me personally. Like there's some things, and so of course I just eat them up. Like for me, I really love psychological horror that leaves you questioning whether or not something is true, whether or not something is real. Partly, I think, because I have had, a mental illness journey throughout my life, and I am deeply terrified of just completely losing any concept of like objective reality. And so whenever a character is in that position and they don't know, am I going crazy, or is this a ghost, or what's happening? I'm like, yeah, no, that's really scary. Tell me, is it a ghost? So that really gets me. And we're kind of living in the darkest timeline. So look outside, and you'll find something to terrify you within like 5 minutes of interacting with the world. So we're not going to run out of material anytime soon, I don't think.
So Henry, what's your darkest timeline looking like? What scares you?
Oh, what TL just said. What doesn't scare me? So much in the world right now, but yeah, I think, as an adult and a parent now, things have. What really scares me is things that are out of my control. Disease, my kids out there in the world. So yeah, that's what keeps me up at night. But I think I come back to horror because maybe there's some battles there that I can win. There's the antagonist, maybe something simpler, because the real life is almost scarier than fiction.
Okay, Paul.
Other than adding onto the pile of saying 2021 is the scariest thing, no, I'll say personally, my biggest fear is heights, but that's just more of like a unsubstantiated, just can't stand being too high off the ground, which was fun living in condos in Toronto back in the day. But no, in regards to like other things that scare me currently in this world, I would say my own imagination. I'm the oldest of 3 siblings. I was a camp counselor for a good chunk of time in my teens and 20s, and I've worked with kids all my life. So my brain is naturally wired to go to worst case scenario first, so that I can protect against it happening and make sure nobody gets hurt or upset or whatever the case might be. And I find that that's absolutely transferred into my everyday life. So it's like, like even just sitting here and doing this interview, I'm just like, but what if somebody just suddenly came into the screen that wasn't supposed to be a part of this interview? And, like things like that. And it's just, I think I just hit a point where I was like, screw it. I'm going to make a productive use of this imagination that I have. And that's how, but I would say my imagination is probably biggest fear right now. But yeah, which sounds terrible.
Thankfully, I left my mask, so we don't have any fear of that. Mason, finish us off.
Okay, for me, it's the dark. Kind of go back to what PK said. I have a really good imagination. I think us as writers, we all do. Even readers, like, you have a great imagination. So the dark scares me because I'm like, I can't see it. What's actually in there? And so as much as I try to look bulletproof in like horror movies and horror writing and all this, I can't go into a haunted house. Like a haunted house attraction, I will sit there and I will cry because they just turn the lights off and I'm immediately scared. So that is like my biggest fear. And yeah, it's kind of embarrassing because I should be more or less of a baby about it.
Wow, I did not expect the answer from you again. Okay, I have to take a quick poll. And has anybody here not watched an inappropriate movie when they were about 6 or 8? Raise your hand if you have been. If you've watched a horror movie around 6 or 8.
Oh yeah.
Oh, see, Okay, so there's a common thread going on.
We're all broken.
How many of us started reading Stephen King when we were 8? Holy crap! Okay,
we're figuring it out. We've cracked the code, Rodney.
It's our parents.
Not even parents. It's just that our active imaginations led us to go seek out certain materials. So there you go. Anyway, I do have some questions from the audience.
Right.
How can you tell if a scene would scare or creep out your audience? Anybody want to take this up?
I think if it's
No,
I think if it like scares me, I can assume it's gonna scare someone else, because it's like, I think any other thing where you find something, you know, romantic, someone else is gonna find it romantic. You find it scary, someone else is gonna find it scary. It's an emotion that we all share. So if I'm thinking something's scary, I'm sure someone else is going to. And I write for me, I write what I want to read, and I'm going to assume that there's other people out there that want to read it. And that's kind of what I've been doing.
Cool. Paul, you want to go?
Yeah, I pretty much was going to say almost the exact same thing. It's a very transferable mentality from writing comedy to writing horror, where it's just like, if it makes me laugh, it'll make an audience laugh. If it makes me scared, it'll make an audience scared. I do find, though, that just to add on to that as well, is one really, really successful approach that you can take with horror is not showing what the person is scared of. Like let the reader's imagination do a lot of the work. Like there's a lot of movies nowadays that have sort of steered towards like CGI based horror, where it's like you see the monster in the first 3 minutes and then you see it popping up all the time. It's like, you don't need to see the monster. One of the scariest movies from the 80s was Poltergeist, right? And it was a static TV screen, and then you could only hear what was going on the other side. That's terrifying, because everybody's imagining something slightly different. And when it's custom made fear like that, it's a beautiful thing. So it's like, if you really want to scare your audience, take them into their own minds.
Okay.
Well, and I want to say, building off of that too, another thing that's really important is it's really tempting and really easy to fall too hard on describing the reaction that someone is having. Like, you don't want to write someone being scared. You want to write the scene in a way that the reader will also be scared, right? So if you're focusing all of your attention on, you know, what the character is, you know, feeling on like a surface level of, they're so terrified right now, they're screaming, you're not going deep enough. You want to think about the sensory details of what's happening and kind of create the scene so that the reader is in that same place instead of just watching it.
A great example of show, don't tell. Okay, there are a couple other questions, so we're going to jump to this one. What things in horror would you never write about? Is there such a thing as too cruel or too horrific? Henry, you want to take a turn?
Yeah, I'd say, as people said earlier, yeah, horror's sometimes about the broken people, the underachievers, not underachievers, the underdogs. And yeah, there's only, I think, so much you can put them through before it is cruel and unusual. So yeah, there's lines there I won't cross.
Okay. Mason.
I feel like I've definitely pushed some boundaries. If anyone's read Family Comes First, it's about a family of cannibals, and no women can be born into this family, only men can. So if they have baby girls, they kill them. And I got a lot of backlash against that. The people are saying like killing your daughter is a very cruel thing, and I agree with it 100%. But I've done it in all my books, and that people have told me is too cruel. I've kept it in the books. But yeah, I think horror, like there's different types of horror. So some people do like the more extreme, others don't. And so I think the like warning should be there, but it definitely just depends on your taste.
Well, you think that the warning level would be on it because it is horror.
Yeah, horror. People should assume sometimes, but you never know.
Okay, Tiana, you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, I think this kind of came up in the comedy panel yesterday, and I think it applies to horror as well, because in a lot of ways, horror and comedy are really the same thing. It's just how you're coping with it, but at its heart, it's basically the scenario is the same. You could take most horror plots and turn them into comedies and vice versa pretty easily. But the concept of punching down, I think, applies to horror as well. I think, you know, it's you need to be careful or cautious about what implications you're bringing to the table and whether you mean to stand behind what you're saying, or if you're, casting someone as the villain and not thinking through what it means to cast that person as a villain, right? Like, like Mason was saying earlier with the big twist is, oh, the killer has split personalities. Like, cool, that sounds like a cool twist, except for the fact that now 1 million people have done it and everybody has this idea of what multiple personalities looks like, and it's completely wrong, right? So there's a degree in which you need to be responsible about what it is that you're putting out in the world and being sure that you can stand behind it and that you are willing to co-sign it. But as long as you're willing to stand there and be like, yeah, no, I absolutely meant that. These people, whoever my villains are, they are the villains, and I will stand behind that. Then no, I don't think there are any off-topic, off-limits topics. You just have to be brave enough to commit to it.
Okay. We have a little bit of time left, so I'm just going to get into the last 2 questions. Do you always add lighter elements to make sure things don't get too heavy? Paul, go.
Absolutely. If you keep walloping your readers over the head with like heaviness, like just keep pounding them with it, it's going to be an exhausting read. You gotta pop in a little bit of lightness in there, whether it's a moment of hope or a moment of comedy or a moment of, like a sincere caring or whatever the case might be. It's like, you need to vary it. Best way to describe it is peaks and valleys. Like, take your readers on peaks and valleys. If you're just taking them on a dirt road across the prairies, it's like they're going to get bored of the scenery real quick. So make sure you're switching it up. Give them just a little bit of lightness to cling to. And it also gives you a bit of a break as a writer, too, because you can have some fun in between all this really scary, dark, brooding stuff.
Yeah, if you add all the horror all the time, you get bored of it. 100%. And it no longer terrifies you.
Oh, I mean, if Pennywise is in the same room as you all the time, eventually you stop being scared and you're like, just get out. Like, go away. I'm done.
Yeah, come back.
Unless it's the Tim Curry Pennywise, in which case, by all means, hang out.
Okay, Mason, I think I already know the answer to this one, but do you add lighter elements?
I don't know if you know the answer. I do. I like to add little like comedic lines every once in a while. My stories are pretty heavy horror-wise. Just an example of it in Family Comes First, they get a dog and they're cannibals and they're kind of like, are we gonna eat the dog? And the guy was like, we're not monsters, like we don't eat dogs. And so like I have little lines like that along the way, but like I do add like, like the peaks and valleys, like PK was saying, like, like you got to have those light moments in there. It's just like anything else. Like if it's just horror all the time, like it's too much. Like no one's gonna enjoy that.
All right, so we have 2 minutes left. Let's go with the last question. How was your first horror novel? How was the experience versus what you do now? Tiana.
Well, my first horror novel that I read was a Stephen King. I want to say it was The Langoliers, is a novella of his. And that blew my mind. The first thing that I wrote, and I think this is funny, is I spent a really long time not thinking that I was a horror writer because I didn't think I was scary. And so I loved horror and I thought it was really great, but I was like, no, I could never write horror. I'm not any good at it. And then I look back in hindsight and realized that everything that I'd been writing my entire life had been horror, and I just wasn't thinking of it in those terms. So when I came to kind of embrace that as a more like experienced writer, a lot of pieces kind of fell in place. And it's like, oh, maybe the reason why I never fit in with the fantasy people is because I couldn't stop having monsters eating people. Oops.
Okay, we do have like 1 minute left, so I'm just gonna end it with your favorite horror novels. Mason.
My favorite horror novel is probably Rosemary's Baby by Year 11. That is really, really creepy. And I know if I'm ever pregnant, I'm going to read it again just to scare the crap out of myself. And that's probably my favorite book.
It by Stephen King.
Which one?
It.
All right.
Yep.
TL?
Right now, I am obsessed with Paul Tremblay and Grady Hendrix. I'll read everything that they've written. They're the best in the genre right now, in my opinion.
And Paul.
Specific titles always change, but I'm always up for reading anything Clive Barker or Stephen King.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us and entertaining us, and breaking the code on what is the common code with the horror writers. So you guys can all carry that, and in the audience, ask yourself, what were you reading when you were 8 years old? Next panel is the sci-fi panel. I believe it's called, what's it called again? Oh yes, come on, you guys are in this one. Everything is better in space. I was hoping you to jump in. Anyway, everything is better in space. So the sci-fi panel is coming up, and thank you for joining us, and we are out of here.